You won't believe the nerve some people have, and when I tell you what happened to me, you'll probably be shaking your head in disbelief. Imagine this, you own 3,000 acres of land that isn't just property on a piece of paper, but land that carries your family's history, sweat, and legacy. My grandfather worked these fields, raised cattle here, and built his life around it. He always told me, this land is our backbone. Protect it with everything you have. I never thought one day I'd have to fight tooth and nail against an HOA, yes, a simple homeowners association, that decided they could just steal it right out from under me. It all started with a phone call. I was at home one afternoon, going over some ranch paperwork when my phone buzzed. It was a buddy of mine who worked in real estate. He sounded casual at first, but then he said something that made my stomach drop. "Hey, man, I didn't know you were selling part of your land. I just saw 800 acres under your name listed as sold to a developer." I laughed at first, thinking it had to be some kind of mistake. Me? Selling 800 acres? No way. But when he sent me the official county record, I almost dropped the phone. There it was, in black and white, a deed transfer showing that a huge section of my ranch land had been sold. My name was scribbled on the documents like I had signed them myself. The developer had already started planning to build a gated community on the land. My heart raced. I hadn't signed a single paper. I hadn't spoken to any developer. And the land they claimed was sold? That was my grandfather's grazing field, the same ground I walked every morning to check on my cattle. The thought of bulldozers tearing through it made me sick. I drove straight to the county office to get copies of the files. When the clerk handed them over, I stared in disbelief. The signatures weren't mine, but someone had done a pretty convincing job forging them. The notary stamps were there, the maps were drawn, everything looked neat and official, but I knew it was all fake. Someone had gone to great lengths to make it look like I had willingly sold my land. And when I looked closer at the documents, my blood boiled. The buyers weren't some random outsiders, they were connected to the HOA that bordered my ranch. The same HOA that had always complained about my ranch trucks ruining their view, or my cattle getting too close to their lake. Suddenly, it all clicked. They weren't just annoyed neighbors, they had been plotting behind the scenes. I didn't waste a second. I drove straight to the HOA clubhouse. The president, a woman named Karen, yes, her actual name, was there, sipping coffee like she owned the world. I walked right up to her, slammed the documents on the table, and demanded an explanation. She didn't even flinch. She glanced at the papers, looked back at me, and gave me the smuggest grin I'd ever seen. "Oh, that," she said casually. "We streamlined the land into our community. You weren't really using it, so we decided it made more sense for us. It increases the property values around here." My jaw nearly hit the floor. "Streamlined? You forged my signature and sold my land." I snapped. She leaned back, crossed her arms, and with that smug tone people like her always use, said, "Well, technically, it's already done. The developer's paying, houses are planned, and you're outvoted. You should be grateful. You'll benefit from higher land values too." I could feel the rage burning in my chest. She was talking like this was some simple neighborhood vote about lawn decorations, not grand theft on a massive scale. I stared her down and told her straight, this isn't over. Not by a long shot. But deep inside, I already knew I was in for the fight of my life. That night, I sat on my porch, staring out at the dark silhouette of the ranch. Every tree, every fence post, every acre meant something to me. It wasn't just dirt. It was heritage. My grandfather had fought droughts, storms, and debt to hold on to this land. Now some arrogant HOA thought they could just sign it away with a few fake papers? No. Not happening. As I sat there, I thought about all the times the HOA had tried to push me around. They hated my cattle getting near the lake, even though the lake sat partly on my property line. They complained about my tractors being too noisy. They even once sent me a letter saying my barn didn't fit the aesthetic of their neighborhood. I had ignored them all, because honestly, I thought their little rules didn't apply to me. And they didn't. But now I realized what they were really doing. They weren't just annoyed neighbors, they were predators circling, waiting for a chance to take what wasn't theirs. And they thought they had finally pulled it off. The next morning, I called my lawyer. He was an old friend of my grandfather's and had handled our family's property for years. When I showed him the forged documents, he whistled and shook his head. "This is bad," he said. "But it's also sloppy. They've overplayed their hand." He explained to me that this wasn't just a civil matter. This was outright fraud. Forging signatures, falsifying records, filing illegal deeds, that's criminal. The HOA had gone way past petty neighborhood nonsense. They had stolen from me, and they thought I couldn't fight back. Well, they were wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying Karen's smug smile in my mind, the way she acted like I should just roll over and accept it. I thought about my grandfather, how he would have never let anyone steal from him. I thought about the years I spent taking care of this land, the cattle I raised, the fences I mended. And then I thought about the developers' bulldozers waiting to roll in. The anger turned into resolve. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to expose them, humiliate them, and make sure they paid for every lie they'd told. They thought I was just one man up against an HOA board with lawyers and money. What they didn't realize was that I had something they didn't: truth, evidence, and the law on my side. And I was about to use it all to bring them crashing down. I wasn't about to let them get away with it, not after seeing the way Karen smirked at me like she had already won. The next morning, my lawyer and I rolled up our sleeves and started digging into every piece of paperwork the HOA had filed. It was like peeling back layers of rot. The deeper we looked, the uglier it got. There were not just forged signatures, mine was on multiple pages where I had supposedly granted the HOA the right to manage my land. There were notarizations from an officer who had supposedly verified my identity, except when we checked, the notary had retired years before those papers were filed. Even the maps they submitted to the county had been altered, redrawn to make my land appear as part of their subdivision. It wasn't sloppy, it was deliberate, like they had been planning this for years. The developer who bought the land clearly thought it was a done deal too. Their bulldozers were already parked on my soil. They had staked out plots for future homes, even advertised new luxury lots with lake access. And there I was, standing on my porch, staring at big orange machines lined up like vultures waiting to feast. It made my blood boil. My lawyer told me we had a case for fraud, theft, and damages, and we immediately filed suit. We expected the HOA to panic, maybe even come to the table and beg for a settlement. But instead, they doubled down. They walked into that courtroom with their expensive suits, their smug grins, and their army of lawyers, acting like this was all some minor paperwork issue. Karen even stood in front of the judge and said, "Your Honor, this man is only upset because he doesn't understand how community property works." The HOA acted in the best interest of the neighborhood. I wanted to shout right then and there, but my lawyer squeezed my arm and whispered, "Let them hang themselves." And that's exactly what they were doing. They acted confident, but what they were really doing was stalling. Every hearing dragged on for weeks, then months. They filed motion after motion to delay, to bury us in paperwork, to make me spend money until I gave up. I started to understand their game. They thought if they stalled long enough, the developer would finish building houses, families would move in, and by then it would be too messy for me to reclaim my land. They were trying to exhaust me, financially and mentally. And to be honest, there were nights when I almost believed they'd succeed. I'd drive past those bulldozers and half-finished foundations and feel like I was losing. My grandfather's grazing fields were being torn apart, the same ones where I used to ride as a kid. The soil was ripped open, the air filled with dust. Every time I saw it, my chest tightened. It wasn't just about money anymore, it was about pride, about legacy, about fighting back against people who thought rules didn't apply to them. But while they thought they were wearing me down, I was digging deeper into their history. I started requesting HOA records, old property deeds, and water rights documents. I went through dusty boxes in the county archives, stuff no one had looked at in decades. And then I found it, the piece of the puzzle that would change everything. The HOA loved to brag about their lake system. They held boat parades, fishing tournaments, and summer parties there. They even charged their members extra fees every year for lake maintenance. But when I traced the water rights, I discovered something they either didn't know or chose to ignore. Those lakes, dams, and waterways were never deeded to the HOA. My grandfather had built parts of that system generations ago to irrigate the ranch. Later, he had signed a limited lease agreement that allowed the community to use the lakes recreationally. But, and this was the kicker, he had never transferred ownership. The water rights and land under those lakes legally belonged to my ranch. In other words, while the HOA had gone out of its way to illegally claim my grazing fields, they had built their entire community's identity around a lake system that wasn't even theirs. I couldn't believe it. All those years of them bossing me around, sending me letters about my barn being an eyesore, and here they were, partying on water they didn't even own. I brought the documents straight to my lawyer. When he read them, his eyes widened. "Do you realize what this means?" he asked. "They've been collecting fees on property they don't own. You could not only shut down their access, you could sue them for every penny they've taken from homeowners." For the first time since this whole mess started, I felt hope. Suddenly, I wasn't just the guy fighting to get his land back. I was the guy holding the HOA's golden goose in my hands. My lawyer filed motions to introduce the lake rights into the case, and when we walked into that courtroom again, I could see the panic start to spread across the HOA board members' faces. Karen tried to put on her usual smug act, but even she couldn't hide the way her hand trembled as she shuffled her papers. When the judge looked at the deeds and confirmed what we had found, it was like a thunderclap. The HOA's lawyers scrambled to argue that the lakes were essential community property, that removing them would destroy the neighborhood. But the law didn't care about their feelings. The law cared about documents, signatures, and rights. And the documents said the lakes were mine. I'll never forget the look Karen gave me across the courtroom that day. For the first time, she wasn't smirking. She wasn't confident. She looked scared. And that was just the beginning. Because once I realized I had leverage, I knew exactly how to use it. I wasn't just going to defend my land anymore. I was going to turn the tables. They thought they had buried me under fake paperwork, but what they didn't know was that I had the one card they could never beat, the ability to take away the very thing that held their neighborhood together. Their precious lake system. And I was ready to play it. When I realized I had the upper hand, everything shifted. For months I had felt like the underdog, fighting a giant machine that had lawyers, money, and a whole community backing it. But now, I wasn't just defending myself anymore, I was holding the very lifeline of that community in my hands. Their lake wasn't theirs, and the documents proved it. My grandfather's old lease had long expired, and I had every legal right to terminate it. My lawyer looked me dead in the eye and said, "You don't just have a defense, you have a weapon." And that was the moment I decided I wasn't going to play defense anymore. I was going on the attack. The next step was simple but devastating. I filed official paperwork terminating the lease agreement that allowed the HOA access to the lakes. From that moment forward, they no longer had legal rights to fish, swim, or boat there. And I made sure everyone knew it. I had new signs printed, massive ones, and within a week, crews were out by the shoreline driving posts into the ground. The signs read in bold, unforgiving letters, private property. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. I'll never forget the day the first HOA family pulled up to the dock with their boat, kids ready to go tubing, only to see my crew putting up those signs. The looks on their faces went from confusion, to disbelief, to full-blown outrage. Parents stormed up to me demanding answers, shouting that I couldn't do this. I stayed calm and told them, take it up with your HOA board. They're the ones who lost you this lake. Word spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. Within hours, HOA members were calling an emergency meeting, demanding Karen explain how the community centerpiece, the lake they'd all paid for, maintained, and enjoyed, was suddenly off limits. And Karen, for the first time, didn't have a smug answer. She tried to spin it, saying I was vindictive and trying to punish the community. But homeowners weren't buying it anymore. They wanted answers, and they wanted blood. Meanwhile, I wasn't finished. I had already contacted a private outdoor recreation company that specialized in lakeside resorts. They didn't hesitate when I offered them the chance to purchase exclusive rights to the entire lake system. Their executives practically salivated at the idea. A pristine set of lakes, already partially developed, with docks and infrastructure ready to go. It was a dream deal. And within weeks, we signed a contract. The check cleared, $12 million wired into my account. And just like that, the lakes officially belonged to a private resort company. The resort wasted no time. They sent their own crews to fence off every entry point. They patrolled the area with security, posted guards at boat ramps, and handed out shiny new brochures advertising exclusive members-only access. HOA residents who had once bragged about living in a lakeside paradise now stared through chain-link fences at water they couldn't touch. Their docks were useless, their boats sat dry, and their summer plans evaporated overnight. And the blame fell squarely on their own board. I showed up at the next HOA meeting, not because I had to, but because I wanted to watch the fireworks. The room was packed, standing room only, with angry residents shouting over each other. When Karen tried to gavel the room to order, a man in the front row shouted, "You told us our lakes were safe. You charged us thousands in fees every year for maintenance. What did you do with that money?" Another resident waved one of my new signs in the air, screaming, "Explain this." Karen's face was pale. She stammered, tried to redirect the anger at me, but it was no use. People weren't dumb. They knew I had every legal right to do what I did, and the documents I'd already shown in court proved it. All the rage turned inward, toward the people who had lied to them. Board members started resigning on the spot. One woman actually threw her resignation letter at Karen and stormed out. It was chaos, and I stood in the back, silent, arms crossed, watching the empire crumble. The fallout was bigger than even I expected. Without access to the lake, property values in the neighborhood plummeted. Families who had paid premium prices for lakefront homes suddenly owned houses facing a private resort fence. Realtors stopped answering HOA calls. New buyers backed out of deals. Within months, some residents were underwater on their mortgages, furious and desperate. And while all that was happening, the developer who had bought my stolen land learned the truth. When the court ruled that the sale was fraudulent, thanks to all the forged documents I had uncovered, the developer realized they had been conned. Their bulldozers and half-finished homes now sat on land that wasn't legally theirs. And who did they turn their anger toward? The HOA. They filed their own lawsuit, demanding damages for fraud and breach of contract. Suddenly, the same board that had laughed at me in court was drowning in lawsuits of their own. I can still remember the look on Karen's face when the developer's lawyers confronted her outside the courthouse. She looked like someone who had been caught cheating at cards in front of the whole table. Gone was the smugness, the confidence. She was sweating, pale, and whispering frantically to her lawyers, who by now were charging fees so high even the HOA's budget couldn't keep up. And as for me? For the first time in months, I felt peace. My land was mine again, safe and protected. The bulldozers were gone, the fraudulent sale overturned. And I had more money in the bank than I ever dreamed possible. The $12 million from the lake sale gave me the freedom to rebuild, replant, and even expand my operations. I repaired the fences, replanted trees along the old grazing fields, and restored the land my grandfather once walked. But what gave me the most satisfaction wasn't the money, or even the court victories. It was the knowledge that the very people who tried to destroy me were now facing the consequences of their own arrogance. They had stolen from me, lied about it, and laughed in my face. And in return, I had taken from them the one thing they valued most, the lake that defined their entire neighborhood. They thought they had written me out of the story. Instead, I wrote the ending they never saw coming. In the end, everything came crashing down for the HOA, and it happened faster than even I expected. They thought they could play with forged documents, intimidate me, and bury me in court motions until I gave up. What they didn't realize was that every move they made only built the rope they were about to hang themselves with. And when the final blow landed, it was devastating. The court's ruling was clear: the land sale was fraudulent. My property was restored in full, and the developer's contracts with the HOA were nullified. The bulldozers that had scarred my grandfather's fields were ordered to be removed. The half-built foundation sat abandoned, weeds growing through the cracks like nature itself was taking revenge. I stood out there one morning, watching crews haul away the heavy machines, and I swear I could almost hear my grandfather's voice in the wind saying, "Good job, son. You fought for it." It felt like closure. But for the HOA, there was no closure, only fallout. The developer wasn't about to just walk away after sinking millions into a deal based on lies. They sued the HOA for damages, and the HOA's insurance didn't even begin to cover the amount. That meant the board members themselves were held personally liable. Imagine being one of those smug little power-hungry neighbors, used to throwing your weight around at board meetings, and suddenly realizing you might lose your house because of Karen's brilliant plan. Panic spread through their community like wildfire. Board members started pointing fingers at each other. Some claimed they didn't know about the forgery, others swore they had voted against it, and a few outright blamed Karen for manipulating them. The unity they once boasted about shattered overnight. Meanwhile, the residents themselves were furious. They had been paying extra HOA fees for years for lake maintenance, on a lake the HOA never owned. They had trusted their board to protect their property values, and now those values were tanking. People who had paid top dollar for lakefront homes were staring at fences with "private resort property" signs. Boats sat idle in driveways, useless. Kids who had grown up fishing off the dock were now banned from stepping foot in the water. Every family meeting turned into a shouting match. Parents screamed at board members in grocery store parking lots, demanding refunds, demanding answers. Karen couldn't go anywhere in town without being confronted. I still remember the day she resigned. It wasn't dramatic, not the way she probably imagined it would be. No farewell speech, no dignity. Just a piece of paper slid under the HOA office door and her house listed for sale a week later. Word got around that she couldn't keep up with the lawsuits, that her own property was facing foreclosure. The same woman who once told me I should be grateful they'd stolen my land was now packing boxes and disappearing out of the neighborhood in the dead of night. That's karma if I've ever seen it. But this wasn't just about her. The HOA as an institution collapsed. With lawsuits piling up, with residents refusing to pay dues, with property values nosediving, the association couldn't function anymore. They had no money, no credibility, and no leadership. What was once a tightly controlled, rule-obsessed neighborhood became a ghost of itself. Grass grew long, houses sat unsold, and the so-called dream community turned into a cautionary tale. Realtors in the county even started warning clients, "You don't want to buy there, too much trouble." And me? I thrived. With the $12 million I had made from selling the lake rights to the resort, I invested back into my land. I restored the fields that had been torn up, planting new grass for grazing. I hired extra hands to help run the ranch, built new barns, and even started a wildlife preserve program that allowed local schools to bring kids out to learn about conservation. The same land the HOA had called unused was now alive with growth, cattle, and community programs. It felt like a victory not just for me, but for everyone who believed in standing up to bullies. One of my proudest days was when I invited some of the local families, the ones who had never been part of the HOA but lived nearby, to come enjoy my land. We held a barbecue, opened trails for hiking, and let kids ride horses. The laughter that echoed across those fields reminded me of my own childhood. That was the legacy my grandfather wanted, not some HOA clubhouse with fake rules. And the resort? Well, they turned that lake system into something incredible. They built a lodge, set up boat rentals, and created hiking trails. Tourists started coming in from all over, paying good money to enjoy what the HOA had once taken for granted. Every time I drove past the gates and saw families enjoying themselves, I smiled. Not because I wanted to rub it in, but because it proved the point: property, when respected and managed properly, can bring joy. When stolen and abused, it brings nothing but ruin. Sometimes, I still run into former HOA members in town. They lower their eyes when they see me, ashamed, embarrassed, or maybe just angry at themselves. A few have even come up to me quietly and admitted, "We didn't know what Karen was doing. We should have stopped it." I usually just nod. I don't need their apologies. The land is mine again. Justice was served. That's enough for me. But the best moment, the one I'll never forget, happened about a year after everything went down. I was driving by the old HOA clubhouse late one evening, and I saw the dock. Abandoned, weeds growing through the wood, the water beyond fenced off with big private signs. And right there on the fence someone had spray-painted in big red letters, "Thank Karen." I laughed so hard I had to pull over. It was poetic justice, the perfect symbol of what happens when arrogance meets reality. So if you're listening to this story and you've ever had to deal with an HOA pushing too far, remember this: they're not invincible. They rely on intimidation, on making you believe they hold all the power. But if you know your rights, if you dig deep enough, and if you refuse to back down, you can win. I didn't just win back my land, I turned the tables so hard that the very people who tried to ruin me ended up ruining themselves. The HOA tried to illegally sell my 3,000 acres. They thought they were clever, untouchable. Instead, I legally sold their $12 million lake system, and I walked away stronger, richer, and prouder than ever. And they? They lost everything. That's not just revenge, that's justice.